those of you that are sitting right at the back of the room, I really don't mind if you want to leave early, but it would be very nice if you just would mind coming forward a bit. It makes things feel a bit more convivial. And also, you're that much closer to the images, since the lectures are entirely to do with paying attention to images, it's quite good to be closer to the pictures. Thank you. This week, we are going to talk about one work again, but we're going to get to it by a slightly circuitous route. And the reason for that is that the image we're going to look at, I think, justifies being included in a series of talks about looking at paintings, even though it's a photographic work. And the reason I think it justifies being in a series of looking at paintings is that the principal or apparent subject of the photographic work is a painting. We're not going to look at it straight away, although those of you that were here a few minutes early might have seen it on the screen. The work that we're going to find our way towards is a photographic piece by contemporary Canadian artist Jeff Wall. And if you've seen Jeff Wall's work, you'll know that he always presents his photographs as luminous, backlit, lightbox photographic works on the wall. The particular work we're going to find our way towards is called Restoration. Restoration. It was made in 1993. And the subject we'll see is an existing, and still existing, complete 360-degree panoramic painting in Switzerland. We're going to arrive at it by looking quite quickly at a number of historical moments that raise the issue of the place of ruins, in the iconography of photography and film and painting. And the reason that we're going to work our way towards this image by looking at some examples of ruins in the span of modernity, I suppose, really hinging, although we look at some more ancient examples, it hinges around some 18th to 20th century span. The reason we're looking at ruins in advance is because of the title of the work, Restoration, which implies a certain repairing or treatment of something damaged. And we're also going to approach it this way for a conceptual reason, and that is an idea the artist himself, Jeff Wall, has about the development of figurative painting, in which, and we'll explore this later, he talks about figurative idioms of painting being in a kind of state of ruin. So, to begin, I don't know if I'm going to be too loud or too quiet. Is that all comfortable? Ooh, that's too loud. Is that comfortable? Sounds a bit echoey back here. How's that? Okay. Last week we spent a lot of time exploring this image of a single figure in an icy, wintry landscape. And there is a kind of wintry dimension that links things a little bit for us today. But I just wanted to remind us, that amongst the other things we talked about were the relationship between this flattened, rather flat, two-dimensional, strong shape, parallel to the picture plane, the vertical picture plane of the canvas, and related to a representation of a sheer horizontal plane in the form of the frozen lake or loch. We thought about the distribution of paint across a surface as being a significant and very important physical dimension to painting. And it's the one aspect of painting that we can never fully address in these lectures because we're in the absence of actual paintings. But we drew a kind of parallel, or I did, between this notion of a skin of paint being spread across the body of the surface of the painting. And these bodily associations, I hope, will come back, resurface somewhat today. I acknowledged that this was a painting made in a pre-photographic era, and I think that it'll lead us to considering how relationships are established between representations of the body in pictorial space as we move further into the work that we're looking at today. Well, we might start in a period almost simultaneous with Henry Raeburn's painting of the Reverend Robert Walker, but instead of the field of painting, of which I think we could regard the Raeburn as a pretty consummate example of easel painting of the time, of the painting made as a mobile, movable object. But the parallel we're looking at, in terms historically at least, is another dimension of a kind of romanticism expressed in the form of landscape design. And although the image on the right isn't a photograph of Stourhead, because I couldn't find a photograph of Stourhead in time this afternoon, the garden in England that I would start us off with is Stourhead in Wiltshire, the landscaping of which was carried out in the 1740s by Flitcroft. And like the example we see on the right, Stourhead is known for its classical temples, its grottos, and the appearance of an apparent ruined bridge structure, castle-like, very typical of a kind of high romantic garden design in which ruins were built from scratch to introduce the fantasy of pre-inhabitation of the landscape determined by the appearance of an historical moment. Another manifestation of a fascination with the ruin occurs in images like these. These are two examples of photographs that were being made at the time of the real onset of archaeological exploration of the Middle East in particular. And both of these photographs, I think, fall into the category of a kind of picturesque or Orientalism. In other words, there can be little doubt that the photographer of the image on the right positioned the figures compositionally in order to make the photograph. And these are just two images of highly stylized representations of ancient ruins. What they don't convey, or they didn't, to the popular market for these kinds of images was another reality of the archaeologist's approach to surviving remains. And this photograph, and this one too, come out of a completely different category of archaeological photography. And they are documentary records of archaeological digs of sites, of entrances to trenches and tunnels. And they reveal a completely different dimension, I think, of the appropriation and exploration and appropriation of other cultures by the archaeologists concerned. So there is another form of presence, I think, to the notion of the archaeological towards the very end of especially towards the end of the middle of the 18th century with the advent of photography and the dissemination of more and more images. And it's a notion of what might lie beneath a surface. And this notion of surface and what may appear or to actually lie beyond a surface or actually to is something that we might keep in mind again in relation to the central issue of painting. Famous. At the same time that Stour Head was being built with its apparently classical temples and grottos and ruined masonry structures, was the excavation of Pompeii, started in 1748. And about more than 100 years later, Freud was famously to comment that he thought the true destruction of Pompeii began when it was excavated, not when it was lost with most of its population beneath the ashes of the great volcano in 79 AD, but that its true destruction began when it was excavated. Freud was keenly aware of a kind of strong parallel or metaphor when it came to the notion of surface appearances and concealed depth, and was fully cognizant of a parallel between the efforts of the archaeologist and his own development of psychoanalysis and the recognition of the significance of the unconscious mind. Photograph on the left is of one of the great lava flows, the photograph on the right of the streetscape. We may be more familiar with these kinds of perspective photographs of the revealed streets in extraordinary condition. But what Freud wasn't to know, that his remark was actually more literally true than he probably intended it. Contemporary archaeologists, I discovered at a seminar some years ago, are contemplating reburying large parts of Pompeii in order to protect it from the destabilizing ravages of occasional earth tremors, to protect it from, well, it's almost too late to protect it from the ravages of art theft and vandalism, and also to try to protect it from the all too real destructive power of tourism, the wear and tear of tourism. And so it is quite literally true that parts of Pompeii are being considered with the possibility of reburying them, even within things like huge quantities of polystyrene. Now, just thinking aside slightly around this notion that we began with Henry Raeburn's Skater and this representation of, in part of landscape, the Crystal Palace of 1851, Paxton's great building, literally did contain within it a large section of the landscaped gardens of Kensington Gardens. And in his fascinating gallop through the conditions of modernity, Marshall Berman, in his book All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, quotes contemporary accounts of the Great Exhibition and the experience, the phenomenological experience of being a person inside such a vast, contained, constructed space. And the descriptions of the moment are all to do with the operation of, for example, the dissolving effects of aerial perspective, literally dissolving the rigid structure of the building to the eye, very much as a deep landscape might dissolve a mountain range or geological feature. Sadly, when removed to Sydenham, the great Crystal Palace fell victim to fire, which destroyed it, as you can see on the left. And there is a certain kind of trauma, I think, attached historically to the loss of the Crystal Palace building, which brings it in some way into this issue of the ruin for us as we work towards Jeff Wall's picture. Of course, the very great trauma of the era immediately preceding that event was the Great War, as it is known, World War I, particularly in its European battlefields, and these are aerial photographs of World War I battlefields, almost erased by explosion, so overlapping with each other, the kind of erasure of landscape takes place. And there's an issue here, I think, with the notion of spatial apprehension, which comes to influence awareness of painterly representation of space. And that is something to do with proximity and closeness. Here, a distance established by the first real application of aerial photography, which of course were terrible masks in terrible proximity around these photographs several hundreds of feet below the camera here, and represented by these very well-known and still deeply shocking photographs. Now, really the last preceding European conflict before the First World War, that enters this frame anyway, in particular, was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. The rather interesting motley group you see on the left-hand image here is a group of painters, and amongst them is a soldier who was in one of the French armies of the Franco-Prussian War. His name was Courtauld, and he became the key artist in the orchestration of the great 360-degree panorama that celebrated a particular historical moment, and that is contained inside the scroll you see in the right-hand image. That cylinder is the building that houses the 360-degree panorama. This artist was in a retreat of the French armies that crossed the border into Switzerland, and the subject of the panorama was that retreat. The reason that it held such significance for Switzerland, such significance that it became the subject of a panorama, which at the time was probably the most popular form of spectacle entertainment, drawing huge crowds in most major cities. The reason that it had this significance for Switzerland was that a few years before, in 1864, the Geneva Convention had been founded in Switzerland, out of which grew the establishment Red Cross. The retreat of these defeated French armies into Switzerland enabled the first application of Red Cross aid to a foreign power after its establishment. So you can see the historical significance that it has for Switzerland. Why was Jeff Wall interested in it, I wonder? Well, he produced this work in 1993. I'm sorry it's divided into two here, but it's a reasonable scene down the middle. But using two projectors will enable us to look a little further into the picture. What we're looking at, as you can see, is a curving wall, and the wooden structure in the left-hand half of the composition is actually the viewing platform that a member of the public might have climbed up into in the late 19th century in order to view the panorama. In other words, Jeff Wall's established a point of view for himself and his camera which is outside the viewpoint intended by the designers of the panorama. He has de-centered himself from that point of view. So we can see not only evidence of the painting itself, but we can also see the site from which a viewer was intended to look at it. You can see above that wooden platform a great black shape which, if you look to the very uppermost top left-hand corner, you can just see the detail of drapes. This is a giant black cylinder of curtain which hovers over the viewer, which removes from the viewer's point of view the visibility of the skylight, which otherwise illuminates the 360-degree panorama. What seems to be going on is a process of restorers working on the fabric of the panorama. We can see two scaffolding trestles with people positioned on both of them, a small group silhouetted on the viewing platform, and a woman in a white coat with a clipboard in the middle foreground. There are pieces of paper apparently stuck to the surface of the panorama. So let's look into this a little bit. When we get closer into it, we can see that actually the condition of the place is pretty dire. There are pigeon droppings all over the foreground woodwork, and pieces of discarded material and timber lying around. But we can also see some detail of extreme perspectives going on in the painting itself, just behind the woman in the foreground. And I think we begin to detect a certain kind of reflective atmosphere in the scene. Actually, Land, are you there? Could you just separate the slide projectors very slightly for me? Just a tiny bit. The one on the... Whoop. Well, and the one on the other side too, that would be great. Can I just ask if anybody in the room has actually been to see this panorama? No? Because it has now had its restoration completed. It actually was restored, and it is now accompanied by those things that most things to do with the visual arts seem to be accompanied by these days: restaurants and bookshops and gift shops. But the yes, Land, could you move the other projector really slightly, the left-hand one? Just could you move the left-hand projector very slightly for me, just to make a gap between the two images now? That's perfect, thank you. At the time, however, that Jeff Wall made this piece of work that we're looking at, it wasn't at all clear whether an actual restoration was underway or not. And something that is certainly true, very much the case, is that it's highly unlikely that this photograph documents an actual moment of restoration at all. In other words, I think we should read it as a completely staged composition. That lends it, possibly a little by chance, a certain something in common apart from the wintry conditions with Henry Raeburn skating painting, which you may recall we discussed how it would have been completely staged within the studio as a composition, the very opposite of a plein air outdoor piece of painting. Looking into the detail of the photograph even a little further here on both sides, one begins to detect something about the reality of the space in which this work was made and exhibited. And we can just start to see on the extreme lower left edge of the picture on the left the presence of actual objects in the foreground space of the painting. And in fact, on all sides, in reality, the panorama is fused into a three-dimensional landscape of objects, figures, pieces of wood, trees, detritus of different kinds, actually physically there in the space. All of this, of course, intended to convince the viewer, the pre-cinematic viewer, the viewer who had not yet witnessed moving images, to convince that viewer of an extreme realism in the representation of an extremely deep space. What I find rather interesting is the way, pictorially, that these pieces of paper, which I understand as the special acid-free archival tissues that restorers use on the surfaces of fragile surfaces to attempt partially to stabilize them, is the way that these rectangles seem to float spatially in front of a three-dimensional space. Here in the left-hand image, which is moving in closer and slightly to the left of the image on the right, you can see what I mean about all of these three-dimensional props. Fences, posts, buckets, and so on. Possibly one of the things about the mood or atmosphere of the work that starts to become apparent when you get close enough to the actual picture to see the figures in it is the fact that most of them appear to exhibit a degree of self-contained composure. Some of them seem to be involved in a kind of reverie, to be gazing into a sort of indeterminate space. I think we see it here and again on the right-hand side. And what they might be looking at, I suppose, is the panorama itself. But there is a suggestion, given Jeff Wall's method of working, that what he's managed to accomplish here is a sort of extremely sophisticated photographic collage himself. If the artists who painted this believed that there was the possibility, for instance, that that some sort of seamless connection could be made between the actual objects in the foreground and the representation of the landscape and the files of soldiers disappearing into the cold distance. If there could be some seamless resolution between those two realms, the three and two-dimensional, then it's certainly true of Jeff Wall that he aspires to a seamlessness in the digital manipulation of his photographs. We'll look at only one other example of Wall's work in a minute when we've looked at this, that demonstrates a sort of tour de force of that at work. So, in other words, it's Wall's typical practice, it's his practice to end up with a photograph that looks like one complete moment of exposure. But in fact, most of his works are composed of many, many different photographs which are then literally collaged with extreme sophistication together to compose a scene that could never have existed in reality. Now, just while we're thinking about this notion of relationships between bodies to landscapes, I wanted to move aside very fleetingly to two examples. This is an early black and white photograph of Cindy Sherman, an American artist, made in the 1970s, in which she referred to a whole body of works as film stills, and she appears in each of them in a different persona. And here she stands on the side of a road, receding into a kind of deep space, and this I think does bear comparisons with other kinds of pictorial conventions. This Turner's famous painting, When Wind, Rain and Steam, exhibiting a classic kind of picture device of deep receding space. Of course, the locomotive rushes out of that space towards us in Turner's painting. Levine's gaze goes down into that space. And here's another example, this Monet painting. There are countless examples, especially within a certain impressionist moment of landscape painting, of the implementing of this simple, deep, perspectival picture-making device. And we find it in the mural. This is what I was looking for. This is Caspar David Friedrich's famous representation of a figure facing what is now generally referred to by art historians as an attempt at a representation of the sublime. What's interesting about both these figures is, I think, their apparent inattention to the presence of a viewer and their preoccupation with what might be contained within these extremely deep spaces confronting them. But it's a form of reverie, possibly not unconnected to the mood of the figures in Jeff Wall's photo work. Now, I want to move just to a slightly different direction to touch on the conceptual dimension of Jeff Wall's picture making. And to clarify what I said in my earlier remarks, what I was referring to is an idea Jeff Wall has about the development of painting in particular through a kind of modernist moment, to the point of arriving at the appearance of the first monochrome paintings in the early 20th century. And by monochrome we mean those first examples of abstraction in which either a significant part of the painting rectangle or the entire surface of the painting rectangle are seemingly treated in a relatively undifferentiated way with the application of one colour over the entire surface. And to this day, the monochrome persists as sometimes it seems almost ubiquitous form of abstraction, with artist after artist revisiting the potential of the monochrome rectangle. But what Jeff Wall's interested in is the first manifestation of that, and I think we might look to Malevich in 1918, for example, 1917-18, those brief, terribly brief years following the October Revolution in Russia, that led to an extraordinary momentum in the visual arts and other arts, but since we're talking about them in relation to painting, and that saw the first appearances of these radical forms of abstract painting. What Jeff Wall draws attention to is a history that goes something like this, and we might agree or to a greater or lesser extent with what he says, or we might disagree with it entirely, but his proposition would be something like this: that up until an early moment in the 18th century, really, that grand themes, grand genres existed in painting as the principal genres in which pictorial invention took place. The grand genres would include, great history painting, the painting of mythological subjects, religious painting, of course, these grand genres. And these have been accompanied, increasingly, and eventually superseded, by the emergence of painting which concentrated on what had been thought of as minor genres, genres like the still life or the portrait, or indeed even the landscape, and certainly the interior. And something I would agree with Jeff Wall about is that it's certainly true that in the late 19th century, and certainly in the first 30 or 40 years of the 20th century, that the principal arenas of pictorial invention occur within those apparently minor genres. If you look to Matisse, if you look to Picasso, it's rare in Picasso, the great genre painting. Guernica, of course, is one of the last possibly great genre paintings of the grand genre, of the major subject. What we find is, for example, within the era of Cubism, to confine what we're thinking about, all of the dynamics of visual invention happen around the still life, the representation of a bottle, of a flower in a vase, of a head against a cushion, and so on. So having tracked a certain sort of route through changes in attitudes of painters towards genres and what they might present in terms of potential, Wall suggests that the arrival of the monochrome, and this is a Malevich black square we see on the left, so to speak, ends something in the history of genres in painting, that it's never quite the same again after that. And what he suggests is that so radical is this form of abstraction that genres aren't, so to speak, in a simplistic way, simply old-fashioned forms. They continue to exist, of course, but he suggests they continue to exist as a sort of, in a somewhat ruined state. And he himself, as an artist, certainly wanders around the ruins of many different genres. So if we take his own point of view about that at face value, then certainly the Restoration photograph looks like a very conscious attempt on his part to engage with
an era when the grand genre was still possible to engage with in the form of this enormous panorama of a major historical and humanitarian event. Oops, sorry. But maybe there's more to this in terms of what we see happening in Wall's treatment of the painting, of the panorama. And what begins to suggest itself is that the restorers, while applying these tissues like bandages or some sort of mending membrane to the damaged surface of the painting, are also, in a sense, building up a rather familiar abstract composition which derives from the appearance of the monochrome. And it is another great persistent dimension of non-figurative painting language, the composition of multiple rectangles. And it's almost irresistibly clear with this white-on-white painting of Maleevich's that Wall's intention is to bring together something of these notions of the figurative and the abstract on the very surface of this great painting. This is a slightly later collage by Jean Arp, more informal in its distribution of rectangles, and it leads us towards the last example of Wall's work, which I want to touch fleetingly. I've got it only in the form of two details, actually. This is one, and this is the other. And this is just to demonstrate how far Jeff Wall is prepared to go in his pursuit of the digital construct that appears to be anything but. I mean, what we might think we've got here is a spontaneous moment on a windy day with everyone caught by surprise. What Wall has set out to do is to try to compose a very, very self-conscious and intended contemporary equivalent to Hokusai's famous Windy Day, complete not with the loss of the hat there that we see, but right up there on the top edge is a little trilby hat flying off into space. Now, of course, it's pretty obvious given the extreme similarities in the composition and the distribution of the elements in the air especially, that this isn't a moment where Jeff Wall has got his models together with an armful of paper and a hat and on a windy day and simply said, okay, now everybody, and they throw everything into the air. The detail of the image is completely constructed and seamlessly so. Now, before we see if there are any questions, we'll just return to this contemplative calm of the work that we've been considering before thinking about what we're going to move on to next week. Without giving too much away about next week's talk, it does centre around my own encounter with a particular restoration moment. Just anecdotally, I'll introduce next week's thoughts. In the late 1980s, I went to Arezzo in Italy for the first time to see one of the greatest cycles of painting in the history of the medium. made by Piero della Francesca in the church of San Francesco in Arezzo. And when I walked into the nave, turned down the nave of the church towards the end of an extremely hot afternoon, the great frescoes were nowhere to be seen. And I discovered that they had been concealed behind builders' nets and scaffolding boards, and that the process of their restoration had just begun. Little did I know that with a little persistence, 2 days later, I would be up on the scaffolding with one of the conservators, literally face to face with these extraordinary frescoes. And that work is at the heart of next week's talk, but I will be seeking to relate it to extremely contemporary, insightful ideas about this, what Adrian Stokes called wall significance, and the art of the very great artist Yannis Kounelis, who I mentioned, I think, to those of you who were here last week, currently has an extraordinary exhibition of work at Modern Art Oxford. But the beginning of next week's talk will be to do with me, the experience of being on the scaffolding of the conservation of the frescoes in Arezzo. So my prepared thoughts end there. We can put the lights on, and I'd be very delighted if there were any questions. At least I think we can put the lights on. There we are. Any questions from anybody? Hello? You've always got good questions. Did you ask James Caseby that question about the black hole in the picture, or was that somebody else?
Yeah.
It was you, wasn't it? I couldn't see you. You were around there, or I was over there.
Yeah.
I thought that was such a good question.
No, you didn't really give me an answer.
Are you in the black hole in the pictures? Anyway.
It seems to me maybe the monochrome offers a depth to it, even though it is a monochrome, by the use of the border. And my understanding of these pictures is the marrying up of the three-dimensional and two-dimensional with the use of in a sense, perspective lines,
Yes.
to vanishing points.
Yes, the vanishing point.
So in effect, you can trick visually perception of depth by using vanishing points, which is why the monochromes, in a sense, need or work better, in my understanding, with a border. Without a border, perhaps you are projecting your own vanishing points within the painting.
I think that happens with some monochromes. And there's an artist called Peter Joseph, who's a very, very interesting and non-figurative artist working in Britain, whose life's work was composed of a kind of, well actually they were sort of duochromes, because there was always a dominant rectangle within a frame, a regular border. And the regular border was always a slightly different colour. And Joseph said that he'd just been driven to this form by spending some time in a cinema waiting for a film to begin, just gazing at these blank cinema screens, not unlike this with a black edge around it. And I think it's absolutely true that there's a different spatial experience potentially within the bordered monochrome. But it's not to say that there aren't other sort of material forms
principal subject is time, probably the miracle of still being alive in the world, and a lot of his work is to do with simply stating dates or extremely large numbers of postcards to people simply saying, Onkuwara is alive, and putting the date on it. Another sort of manifestation of this are small grey paintings. They're often not much bigger than a piece of paper, and they're uniform grey rectangles. But his completion of the work is to very precisely and neatly to paint the date of the completion of the painting on it. That's it. I'm not appealing to you to be thrilled necessarily by it, but there is a certain sort of interesting power about these things when you come across them again and again. But the thing that interested Jeff Wall about Onkuwara was dating and the monochrome as a sort of completion is that the date is painted, so he reduces it in terms of idea to painting on top of a painting. He suggests Onkuwara has made this lovely grey monochrome. There are certainly artists who work within, who make artists like Alan Charlton, if you're interested in the realm of the monochrome, I'd suggest definitely looking at his work. Fantastically lightly proportioned rectangles of different dimensions, and beautifully toned areas, greys, extremely authentic, I'd say, certainly profoundly painted, very structured, abstract composition on the wall. But for Onkuwara to paint the date suggested to Jeff Wall that he was, as it were, he's not painting the date on a blank canvas. He thinks that's a very different thing. He's painting on top of a painting. And I think, as phraseology writer, what Jeff Wall definitely suggests is that after the Malevich moment in a way, that the notion of the blank canvas disappears for some artists. For some artists, that the rectangle is a monochrome before it's anything else, and that whatever is painted on top of the monochrome. It's thought.
I was just really brings to mind the painted by Newman with his zip down the centre, and there's something Barney Newman always talked about was sphere. His work was supposed to evoke human space in the enormous spherical space. So there's a flat wall,
Yes.
human painting. And this diorama seems almost to illustrate that perfectly, because you can that come around behind you. And also there's sublime, I mean, he was always, the scale of his canvases, which were all
Yes.
totally related to this. I was wondering if you all mention anything about Barney Newman. I mean, it seems this totally seems to speak of that
Yes, it does, rather, doesn't it?
ambition.
I think it probably does speak of that. But there certainly is a proximity question.
It's always puzzled me
in
with
this
Barney
thing.
Newman.
Yes.
The things he's written about, there's this idea of sphere, or spherical space, and kind of, it's one of those things that artists write, and you kind of think,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that? Looking at this, I can,
Well, I think it's something to do with the sensation of proximity and what happens at relative distances to certain paintings. I mean, what you're quite right. These talks to do is to try to engage in the different ways through which we pay attention to paintings and engage with them in a very close sense, not always a fleeting sense, but actually examine how we connect with paintings, or the sensation sometimes of how the painting connects with us. The very interesting American art historian and critic Dave Hickey once spoke about the experience of being a fairly rather celebrated international art historian and travelling the international lecture circuit. His always going to museums and startling the audience at first by saying, of course, when I go to the new museum, I go through it, I walk through it as fast as I possibly can, which led to a sharp intake of breath from the audience, who was slightly shocked by this idea, but he followed by saying, and that's because I'm waiting for the art to stop me. In other words, it's not a dutiful museum, is it? You've got to really look at all the constables, and then you've got to look at all the turners, and then you've got to look at the gamesters. It's all too much. We're actually waiting for that, unquantifiable, highly subjective something that draws you to something you've never seen before, and begins the whole potential relationship with it. And part of that, I think, that notion of paying attention to the experience of looking is certainly to be enjoyed in painting through exploring this whole notion of proximity. What happens when you're so close to a surface that you can scarcely focus on it, and what happens to you when you see that same surface 50 yards or 50 meters away at the end of a gallery. Not only because of how the physical application of what used to be called the facture of painting, the actual physical application of it and the register that the surface keeps of that, but simply because of how images dissolve or coalesce and what registers as definite and solid and physical and what suddenly becomes intensely tangible as deep space. And I sometimes find myself being very aware of the fact that certain paintings take me to a particular distance in relation to them over and over again. I could almost imagine somebody with a tape measure discreetly checking that the painting could put me in exactly the same spot as it had 6 weeks ago when I last looked at it. And it does happen somewhat in Barnett Newman. I don't know if those of you that might have seen the big Barnett Newman exhibition at Tate Modern about a year ago. It's still being called by higher powers. The sense of the large field painting. Barnett Newman is a painter, I don't think he invented the term, but who was certainly written about as being a member of a group of artists who were regarded as field painters, whose work extended across surfaces in the manner of a field. But these are things you have to explore with your own eyes, really. I did have one image that I wanted to show to you this afternoon, which I sadly couldn't get. There is a painting, it's not even on the wall at the moment in the National Gallery, by Poussin, called Landscape, with a man killed by a snake. You know that? Have you know that painting? Well, didn't seem that long ago. I always used to go into the National Gallery because you could buy slides of their works in their collection from the bookshop. And I had a slide of this Poussin painting, and I couldn't find it this morning. I thought, that's all right, I'll pop into the National Gallery and get another one. And you can only now buy slides of paintings by mail order, so I couldn't get it. So when I went up to the galleries, because I thought, I'll have to describe it. And it wasn't on the wall. But foreground that then enters into a sort of receding plain of water, a lake, into a complete background of hills and landscape. And there are a number of figures distributed around this space. If this interests you, the American critic Michael Freed wrote very well on the sort of dimension of theatre in the construction of Poussin's paintings, to the extent that Poussin would sometimes actually make small models and situate components of the composition in model in order to resolve these things. But what we see in the lower foreground of this painting is the ghastly scene of a man killed by a snake. It's all grey and dark there, and this grey figure, and the coils of a giant serpent, snake, giant snake, around it. Now, moving up towards the right-hand side of the painting is a fleeing, startled figure of a man who has seen this sight, completely shocked by it. What he can't see is a woman who can see him. In the middle, sort of receiving middle foreground, is a woman crouching, and she is up here. She's up here, and she sees him, but she can't see the man killed by the snake because he's on lower ground. Out on the lake is a small boat, I think maybe fisher folk there. They don't seem to be aware of anything at all. So there is a line of sort of a set of line of sight relationships in the painting. Of who can see this but can't see that, but is aware of something through this line of sight. Actually, is a spatial device for involving the viewer, not only